What drives global economic inequality? What keeps poorer countries from developing? Economists, sociologists, politicians, historians, the World Bank, whoever it may be, they all have trouble defining inequality, let alone getting to the root of its causes. While most agree that in recent years we've seen a global economic convergence, that is to say that most countries are catching up, however slowly, with the developed world, they do also highlight the problems in measuring and confirming that convergence, and they highlight that many countries, what Paul Collier calls the bottom billion, are being left behind, and in some cases getting worse. This graph shows the share of world GDP between developed and emerging countries evening out over the last 15 years. But it should be noted that while many societies are getting richer, inequality within those societies is frequently on the rise, and the bottom billion countries like Afghanistan, Angola, Azerbaijan, Benin, Bhutan, Bolivia, Burkina Faso and Burundi, to name a few, are falling behind. The question, of course, is why? During the Cold War, with the world split between capitalist and communist ideologies, two distinct trains of thought emerged. The first, represented primarily within the Western world, was Modernization Theory, that given the right circumstances and inclusion into the global capitalist market, a country would progress through to modernity. This, of course, was a general theory that umbrellaed many ideas like Rostow's 5 stages of growth. But the general consensus with these ideas was that capitalism is good. The second, capitalism is bad, was structuralism. Structuralism, in its many forms, maintained that it was the very structures of the capitalist system that prevented these poorer economies from developing, and that in many cases they were being exploited by richer countries and societies who were sometimes claiming to help. Structural adjustment programs, or SAPs for example, were and still are loans provided by the IMF and World Bank, both of course capitalist institutions, to countries on the basis that public assets would be privatised and free market reforms implemented. This, its detractors claimed, was little more than capitalist bribery, and who benefits from the reforms? Multinational corporations and businesses based in the West. Structuralism in international relations was mainly divided into two schools, Dependency Theory and WorldSystems Theory. Dependency theory, associated primarily with Latin American countries, asserts that in the capitalist system, resources tend to flow from the periphery, that's poor, underdeveloped countries, to the core, the wealthy Western world. This is because poorer countries, the periphery, tend to provide the natural resources and cheap labour for products designed and sold by businesses in the richer countries, the core. This leads to a unilateral flow of capital, which is simultaneously maintained by the politics, finance, education, culture, and sometimes military of the core. In Marxist terms, that's the superstructure. Think Nike, a cultural icon, opening sweatshops in Bangladesh, and you have the general idea. In other words, the rich countries oppress the poor countries. It's not hard to see why this theory held a lot of sway in the 60s and 70s, with the US backing dictators like Augusto Pinochet in Chile because of his free market beliefs. This, of course, was the height of the Cold War, and keeping communism at bay was at the top of the US agenda. The second structuralist school of thought was WorldSystems Theory. WorldSystems Theory, developed by the American sociologist Immanuel Wallerstein, builds upon, but also fundamentally differs from, dependency theory. In WorldSystems Theory, any analysis of world history and economic development should be studied from the position of the total world system, not through individual states or isolated events. This is because it's the very nature of the world system that creates inequality. For Wallerstein, there are still core and periphery countries, but there are also semi-periphery countries, which represent developing periphery countries and declining core countries. In his analysis, Wallerstein sees history in cycles through which a hegemonic core emerges, like the US or previously Britain and before that the Netherlands, which then for a period dominates the capitalist system. For Wallerstein though, it's not necessarily rich countries that exploit poorer ones, but capitalists exploiting workers in core and periphery countries. For both dependency theorists and world systems theorists, it's the world capitalist system as a whole that leads to inequality and poverty, and the cure for all structuralists is some form of communism. Both of these schools of thought have mostly fallen from favour in recent years, although world systems theory is still popular among Marxists, and I think this has happened for two main reasons. Firstly, communism in its various applications has mostly failed. You just have to look at the Soviet Union, Cambodia, Cuba, North Korea, and the capitalist reforms in China, to name a few, and compare them to the economic growth in the Western world to see whether capitalism or communism has lifted the most people out of poverty. Which leads to the second point. People are being lifted out of poverty. It would take an ardent cynic to claim that the world, despite its huge problems, isn't slowly becoming a better place. So maybe the problem isn't the capitalist system as such, but maybe how you interact with and are a part of that world system. Maybe it's exclusion from the system or malpractice within it that leads to stagnation and poverty. This is certainly the argument of Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson, whose work in the book Why Nations Fail aims to show that it's the inclusiveness of political institutions which determine whether nations succeed or fail, and that democratic, pluralistic systems with strong and guaranteed laws encourage their populations to innovate and build successful businesses and lives. Why Nations Fail uses the example of two of the world's richest men, Carlos Slim and Bill Gates, to show how wealth created through business innovation in a society with political and economic institutions conducive to the encouragement of innovation sparks the creation of further innovation, further jobs, further ingenuity, and further technical progress, which benefits all in that society, i.e., Bill Gates and the United States. On the other hand, wealth created through monopolistic activity or resource extraction, encouraged by what they call extractive institutions, make a few elites in the country richer, while keeping the majority of the population in poverty. In systems like this, unstable laws, bribery, and corruption all prevent citizens from having the courage and encouragement to start businesses and take positive risks to improve their lives. This sort of monopolistic culture, which the telecommunications giant Carlos Slim represents, doesn't spread innovation and development like the invention of the Windows PC did, and so leads to wealth in a country being isolated in the hands of the few, an elite. In The Bottom Billion, Paul Collier points to traps that affect the growth of poor countries. Civil war, or risk of civil war, bad governance and bad neighbours can all hugely affect a country's potential, and ironically, so can being rich in natural resources. The discovery of a large supply of a natural resource like oil can mean a few things for an impoverished nation. First, potential conflict over that supply. Second, a government which benefits from a large influx of capital from natural resources may not have to tax their citizens so highly, which equals less accountability from happy citizens, which equals a higher chance of government corruption. And third, Dutch disease, where a country's reliance on a single commodity makes other industries less competitive and less likely to thrive. An even bigger problem if that resource runs out or becomes less valuable. All of this points towards the idea that it's exclusion from the structures of the capitalist model that's the primary cause of poverty, not inclusion or dependence. Now, that's not to say that dependency doesn't occur. and that dependency theory can't tell us something about the faults of the capitalist system. In his 1978 study, for example, Gary Jeraffe shows how transnational pharmaceutical corporations took control of the Mexican steroid industry in the 1950s. At the time, Mexico was the subject of much pharmaceutical focus because of the wonder drug properties of the native Barbasco plant, which was important for the production of anti-inflammatory drugs and cheaper birth control pills. The corporations would harvest the Barbasco in Mexico and sell it on to a sister company owned by the same corporation at a much lower price than it was worth. The profits would then be moved out of Mexico and declared in tax havens like Puerto Rico and Panama. This is called transfer pricing. Eventually, Mexico nationalized the gathering, processing and sale of Barbasco and fixed the price for sale to the TNCs, but this didn't happen until 1975, some 20 years later. I think what Jeraffe's study shows is that, yes, situations of dependency and exploitation do of course occur, but this is not a systemic inherence of capitalism. It's social, and solutions can be found that can create an even and fair playing field around the world, and people like Collier and Acemoglu are replete with practical steps that governments, countries and societies can take. Collier, for example, reminds us that while elections are incredibly powerful in bringing about change in underdeveloped nations, the second part of the democratic process, checks and balances, are more important and frequently overlooked. Checks and balances within government are an ongoing process that help to highlight and discourage corruption. In Peru in the 1990s, the corrupt government of Alberto Fujimori was brought down by the only one of 10 television stations that Fujimori had not bribed for nearly $1 million a month each. Freedom of speech and transparency is obviously key. Collier suggests that emphasis should be placed on radio being kept from government control and freed from government restraints on entry. Radio stations are cheap to set up, and once they're running, there are likely to be too many of them for corruption within government to control or manipulate. He also suggests budget transparency from the bottom, audits of schools and hospitals, etc., instead of from the top, to help ensure funding and finance reaches its intended destination. So, of course, circumstances of dependency do occur, and structuralism in its many forms can tell us much about the approaches we can take to understand the issues that global inequality and unfettered neoliberalism presents. But I think practical solutions are more likely to be found in the studies of those trying to solve the issues, rather than those who simply speculate on the negative aspects of a model of free trade and openness that has lifted billions out of poverty. If you like these videos and would like to support me making more, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook by clicking the links in the description below. You can like this video and subscribe to the Then and Now channel to see more. And if you're feeling really generous, you can pledge as little as $1 towards the creation of each new video. You can click here to find out more. Thank you.